The workshop smelled of sawdust and turpentine, and on the workbench sat a chair with 3 legs. It had sat that way for 11 years. Not because Elias Moreau didn't know how to attach the 4th leg. He had built entire staircases, cradles, dining tables that seated 12. His hands knew with the way a river knows stone. But this chair, his first true design, the one he swore would launch his own furniture line, remained unfinished, gathering dust in the corner of a workshop that smelled more of regret than resin. Because somewhere along the way, Elias had come to believe something that would quietly cost him the best years of his life. He believed that the chair had to be perfect before the world was allowed to see it. And what he didn't yet understand was that this single belief, so reasonable, so responsible sounding, was the very thing keeping him poor, invisible, and slowly disappearing into a version of himself he no longer recognized. Elias was 44 years old. He rented a workshop behind a hardware store in a town where the winters came early and stayed long. Each morning he arrived before sunrise, put on the radio low, and worked until his fingers ached, building custom cabinets for other people's kitchens, shelves for other people's studies, furniture that carried other people's names on the invoice, never his own. He told himself he was preparing, that the chair, his chair, the one with his signature carved quietly into the underside of the seat, would be unveiled when it was flawless, when the joints were invisible, when not a single person could find fault in it. But the truth, the one he kept buried beneath sawdust and long hours, was simpler and far more painful. He was terrified of what would happen if he finished it and the world didn't care. So instead, he polished the same 3 legs again and again. He redesigned the backrest 4 times. He told his wife, Nor, that it was almost ready so often that the phrase had stopped meaning anything to either of them. And what he didn't yet know was that the man who had planted this belief in him, the belief that unfinished meant unworthy, had been dead for 6 years, and yet still ruled every decision Elias made. Nor found him in the workshop one November night, the space heater humming, his breath visible in the cold air near the window. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she spoke. "You've built us a beautiful life with your hands, Elias," she said quietly. "But I think you've forgotten how to build something for yourself." He didn't answer. He simply ran his palm along the arm of the chair, the wood smooth beneath calloused fingers, and said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't unravel something he wasn't ready to face. She left without another word, and the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have shouted. That night, Elias sat alone on the workshop floor, back against the cold wall, staring at the 3-legged chair like it was a mirror. And for the first time in years, he let himself ask the question he had been avoiding. What if it was never about the chair at all? 3 weeks later, an old man named Tomasz began renting the space next door. A retired shipwright, they said, who now restored antique boats for museums and collectors. He was in his 70s, with hands like weathered bark and a quiet that felt less like silence and more like patience. Elias noticed something strange about him almost immediately. Tomasz's boats were never finished the way Elias expected. There were visible seams, small imperfections left deliberately in the grain, nail heads that showed instead of hiding beneath putty. One afternoon, unable to hold the question in any longer, Elias walked next door and asked him why. Tomasz looked up slowly, wiped his hands on a cloth the color of old rope, and said something that would quietly dismantle everything Elias believed about success. "Because a boat that never leaves the harbor," he said, "never has to prove it can float." Elias laughed, a little uncomfortable, the kind of laugh people give when a joke lands too close to something true. But Tomasz wasn't joking. "You've been in that workshop every day for a month," the old man continued. "I hear you sanding the same piece of wood long after it's smooth. I don't say this to insult you, friend. I say it because I once did the same thing, for almost 20 years, and it nearly finished me before I finished anything at all." And what Tomasz told him next would haunt Elias for days, because it wasn't a story about woodworking at all. It was a story about the lie. Tomasz had once been a young shipwright in Gdansk, apprenticed to a master builder who demanded perfection down to the smallest detail. Every seam had to be invisible, every joint flawless. The master would inspect each finished vessel with a magnifying glass, searching for the smallest flaw, and when he found one, and he always found one, he would shake his head and say the same 6 words. Not yet. It's not ready yet. Tomasz absorbed that sentence like water into wood. He carried it into his own workshop years later, and it became the voice in his head every time he considered showing his work to the world. Not yet. Not ready. Not good enough. For 19 years, he built boats that never touched water. Beautiful, structurally sound vessels that sat in dry storage because some final imperfection always seemed to demand correction. Until the day his daughter, 9 years old at the time, asked him a question that cracked something open in his chest. "Papa, if you never let the boats swim, how do you know they're actually boats?" Tomasz stopped talking there, letting the question hang in the cold workshop air between them. Elias felt something shift in his stomach. Not comfort, but recognition. The kind that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave. Because he realized, with a quiet horror, that he had heard those same 6 words before. Not from a master shipbuilder. From his own father, standing over young Elias's very first woodworking project. A small stool, slightly crooked, built with an 11-year-old's clumsy pride. His father had turned it over once, frowned, and said, "Not bad, but it's not ready to show anyone yet." Elias had never shown anyone anything again without first making it disappear into endless revision. And the wisdom in that realization would cost him something enormous. The comfortable illusion that his perfectionism was discipline, when really it had always been fear wearing discipline's clothing. That night, Elias didn't go home right away. He sat in his workshop long after the sun disappeared behind the treeline, staring at the chair under the single hanging bulb, its shadow long and strange against the wall. He thought about all the pieces he had built for other people over the years, flawless, functional, forgettable. Furniture with no name attached. A career built entirely on other people's visions because his own felt too dangerous to release into the world unfinished, imperfect. His. He thought about his father, a proud man who had never once, in 71 years of life, shown anyone his own unfinished attempts at anything, who had died with drawers full of half-written letters, unread poems, an unopened box of paints he'd bought himself for a 60th birthday and never touched. His father hadn't been protecting Elias from mediocrity. He had been passing down his own unlived life, disguised as wisdom. And in that cold workshop, under a single bulb, something in Elias finally broke. Not violently, but the way ice breaks on a pond in early spring. Quiet, inevitable, a release rather than a shattering. He picked up the 4th leg of the chair, the one he had shaped and reshaped a dozen times, sanded to an obsession, and he looked at it for a long moment. Then he attached it, imperfect join and all, a visible seam, slightly uneven, exactly the kind of flaw his father would have circled with a frown. He left it there exactly as it was and did not touch it again. The next morning he carried the chair, his chair, into the front window of the hardware store where his workshop stood, right where every passerby on the street could see it. His hands trembled as he set it down. Not from cold. He half expected the world to notice the seam first. The slight asymmetry in the backrest. The 7 years of hesitation visible in every choice he'd second-guessed and then finally made. But that isn't what happened. A woman stopped on the sidewalk that same afternoon, stared at the chair through the glass for nearly a full minute, and walked inside. She asked who made it. She asked if he took commissions. She said something Elias would carry with him for the rest of his life. "It feels like something a person actually made," she said, running her fingers along the visible seam near the leg. Not a machine, not a catalog, a person. The very imperfection he had spent 11 years trying to eliminate was the exact thing that made someone want to bring it into their home. Elias didn't become famous. His furniture line didn't make him wealthy overnight, and there was no dramatic music swelling behind some grand unveiling. That's not how real transformation tends to arrive. What changed was smaller and far more permanent. He began finishing things, imperfect things. He signed his name to work that wasn't flawless, because he finally understood something his father never had the courage to learn. A piece of work sitting unfinished in a workshop helps no one. It doesn't protect your worth. It only postpones the chance to discover it. nor noticed the change before he ever said a word about it. She found him one evening not sanding, not second-guessing, but simply sitting beside a finished piece, coffee in hand, at peace with something visibly imperfect. "You look different," she said. "I stopped waiting to be ready," he answered. "I think I was always ready. I was just afraid of what it would mean if I was." Months later, Tamasha's old boat, the one with the visible seams he'd built as a young man and never sailed, finally left the dry dock, restored and repainted, launched into open water at the request of a museum that wanted it displayed exactly as it was. Honest, imperfect, whole. Elias stood on the shore and watched it drift, sunlight scattering across the water like scattered coins. The old wood groaning softly the way old things do when they finally get to do what they were built for. And he understood, standing there with salt air in his lungs, that the lie had never been about readiness at all. The lie was that unfinished meant unworthy, that imperfect meant unlovable, that a person had to become flawless before they were allowed to be seen. But nothing that has ever mattered in this world arrived without a visible seam somewhere. Not a person, not a piece of work, not a single life lived honestly. The chair still sits by the window of that small shop, the fourth leg slightly uneven, the join visible if you look closely enough. People ask about it sometimes. Elias always gives the same quiet answer. "That's the leg that took me 11 years to attach," he says. "I keep it imperfect on purpose. It reminds me that I was never waiting to be ready. I was only ever waiting for permission to begin."